And as Evan indicated, Senator Chase will be speaking in favor of the initiative. Senator Chase has been, I think, in the legislature 12 years now, 8 in the House of Representatives, the last 4 in the Senate. She's a graduate of the UW in political science with a master's as well in political science and social theory. Long line of Washingtonians, 6, 7 generations, something like that going back. So definitely well-grounded in the state and public service in general, and hopefully an articulate voice on behalf of the proponents of the initiative. Speaking against the initiative, Jason Colberg, resident of Lake Forest Park, so a local here also, grew up in the Montana area, went to school Montana State, I believe. Bozeman, okay. Been here 10, 12 years?
20 in
20,
Washington.
Okay.
12 in Lake Forest Park.
There you go. Okay, great. A couple of kids.
2 children.
Deacon over at the Lake Forest Park Presbyterian Church, where we've got some other friends. An educator by trade in the sciences, I believe. And
yeah, math, science, art. Yeah.
Excellent, excellent. And speaking against the initiative. By way of format, we've asked each of the speakers to give us a 3-minute introduction regarding their views on the initiative, both for and against, and then we'll follow up with questions from the audience. There are some papers out on the chairs. If you'd like to fill those out and pass those forward, I'll try and articulate them for our guests, and they'll have 1 minute each to then respond to the questions, and we'll move from there and ultimately have a 3-minute closing. All right. Let's begin, I think, with the proponent, Senator Chase.
Thank you very much for having me, and thank you very much for sponsoring this forum. I have 3 minutes, so I'm going to go very fast. I am in favor of background checks. I am in favor of addressing violence in our state. We know from a lot of research that the 10 states with the weakest gun control legislation have the highest gun violence. We know that. I think that if we're going to curb gun violence, we have to regulate the secondary market for guns. And we must prohibit dangerous people from possessing guns. And furthermore, I think we should impose strong penalties on what we call straw purchasers, people who buy guns for other people when they wouldn't be eligible, I think on gun traffickers, and persons illegally carrying guns. And I think that we should restrict access to dangerous weapons. Now, a lot of times we don't spend time thinking about what kind of violence do we have in our state. Just briefly, I'd like to give you some information on violence in our state. Law enforcement officers are murdered with guns. And the rate of law enforcement officers murdered with guns was 27% higher in our state than in the national average. Law enforcement killers are often prohibited from gun possession, but they obtain these weapons from sources that do not require background checks. And that would be gun shows, internet, private sales, and the like. Women in particular are at risk from gun violence. 226 women were murdered with guns from 2003 to 2012. 1/3 of all of these murders occurred in domestic violence situations. And the number of women murdered with guns in our state is 1.5 times higher than the number of Washington soldiers killed in Iraq and Afghanistan combined. The other thing, young people are particularly vulnerable. Over half the people who were murdered by guns in Washington state in 2011 were under 30 years of age. Another thing I didn't know, school violence. School shootings in Washington are about 2.5 times higher than the national average. 29 people have been killed or wounded over the last few years, including the 10 who committed suicide with guns. Washington state is one of 14 states that have more gun deaths than motor vehicles. If we have did you recall 30 seconds? Okay, thank you. if we could prohibit buyers from acquiring guns online, it is estimated in other studies, there's an organization that has done some work on this. It is estimated that more than 4,000 guns will be transferred to prohibited purchasers this year through just five popular websites on the internet that do not do background checks. And I think it's important for us to know that there are more gun dealers in our state than there are post offices. And most people live within 10 miles of a gun shop. So it will be easy for us to implement background checks. I look forward to your questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Mr. Colberg?
Yeah, thank you as well, Evan, for organizing this. I'm Jason Colberg, and I want to especially thank each of you for being here. I know it's really tough to be coming out to these kinds of events, as you can see by the attendance, but the fact that you've taken the time to do that, and I like to acknowledge that I've taken a lot of time to research this information. We've heard a lot of statistics here. We're both going to be presenting statistics because that's, I think, really important to this. I want to start by acknowledging the handout that I gave you, the 8.5 by 14-inch sheet that is essentially a flow chart that guides people through. It's a little hard to read with the small print, but can more easily guide you through the language of Initiative 594. And I'm going to flat out state that it's really, really, really bad legislation. And I'm not just saying that. I've done a lot of homework, and I'm here to answer your questions and be able to provide you information as to why it's bad legislation. And one of the key factors with this legislation is that it's talking about transfers of firearms from one individual to another individual, possibly back. And in that situation, most of those transfers are going to occur between responsible gun owners like myself, like I know a number of people in this room, and they're going to be burdened with the cost, the time, and the potential of being penalized and even given felonies for those transactions. Many people in Washington State, I'm estimating there are at least 455,000 concealed carry licenses issued in the state of Washington, which allows me, I couldn't find any information on this, but I'm going to guess that there are at least 1 million firearms owners in Washington State. Many of them are not reading this. Many of them are not here. They're not going to know when they go out into the woods and are doing recreational shooting that they're now committing essentially a felony when this happens. And when they find out, they're going to be very upset that this is taking place. And so this initiative is targeting these transfers between gun owners in the attempt to prevent gun violence. But in fact, it's not going to do that. It is going to instead penalize the responsible gun owners. And that's also going to be, I did the homework on this, made the phone calls to the many gun dealers that she's seen in the area, which there aren't as many as she's saying. But it's going to take a minimum of 45 minutes. That's if you already have your concealed carry license. The time it takes to make the appointment, to wait for the appointment if it's busy, up to 5 days for the background check to be done. So an estimate of 45 minutes to 2 weeks for one transfer. Borrowing a gun from a friend for recreational shooting, such as in duck hunting, would take 2 of those. So who knows how long that's going to be. The burden is on the responsible gun owners, and there's zero language in the initiative that really provides any burden, penalty, or will stop actual criminals from attaining guns and doing what they will with them. I'm going to leave it at that. There's a lot more information to present. I hope we're able to present this through your questions as we move forward. Thank you.
And the first question I've got, and I think it would go better to Mr. Colberg to start perhaps, somebody asks, with regard to Initiative 594, are there problems enforcing this?
Well, I was just involved with, I'm pretty actively involved with city governance in Lake Forest Park, and our city council has just decided not to endorse 594, and I was pretty involved with that by providing, I'm an educator, so my goal is to help teach people as to what's going on with this, provide information that helps you make good decisions. And I did that with our city council, and I wasn't the only person. We ended up having about 50-50 people in our community that helped the city council decide not to endorse 594 as a council. Part of this was looking at the resolution that they're considering for endorsing 594, and in that our chief of police, Steve Sutton, indicated there wouldn't really be a financial burden in this. In talking to the firearm dealer that I did about the burden that's created to us as responsible gun owners, I also have found out that these background checks that are going to need to be run as we go to these federal firearm licensees, these dealers, they have to call. If you don't have your concealed carry license, they have to send in documentation to your local police department for you to look it up. So it is going to go to them. They're going to be inundated with extra paperwork. It's going to create a need for more personnel within the police departments, which ours is already strapped for cash there. And so that's going to be the cost burden. I don't know of any way to really enforce this other than people there might be like game wardens and that kind of thing looking over people's shoulders, maybe undercover police officers in the city, things going on like that where people witness things or have set out to intentionally try to catch some of the, maybe they found online that they're tracking, something like that, that they'll enforce, and that'll take extra resources. But I think it's really going to be about who's going to be honest in this situation. And, I want to be as honest and upfront as I can be. And I'm not going to go out into the woods for recreational hunting without going through this process. And it's really going to, and enforcement's going to be reliant on us as individuals to be honest and upfront with the law.
Senator Chase, how are we going to enforce this in private sales and that sort of thing?
Well, this year we have in our country completed 156 million background checks. And of that number, about 1 million were turned down. The Initiative 594 is intended to prevent weapons from getting into the hands of people who should not have them. Doesn't mean that it's perfect, but it is a way to catch people who have mental illness, convicted felons, and the like. We have, or people who are under a court order, such as in the case of domestic violence issues. I'm not saying that it's perfect, but if we can move one step further in keeping weapons out of the hands of criminals, I think it's a good thing to do. I don't believe that a federally licensed gun dealer they right now have a very competent system for finding out whether or not a prospective purchaser of a weapon is eligible to have one. It's very easy to do a computer check, but sometimes it takes more time, and I grant you it could take more time to make a legal transfer of a weapon. But if it keeps a weapon out of a criminal's hand, I'm in favor of it. Thank you.
Thank you. Senator Chase, this one sounds like a good one for you to lead off with. The gun violence in Washington, how many are with legal registered guns and gun owners versus unregistered illegal guns and criminals?
I don't have the exact number. I have it in my notes. Particularly on the statistics on police shootings. We know about that. But unless a gun is captured, it would be, somewhat difficult, I think, if someone gets away. But if you take a look at this handout that I gave you, Washington State is for background checks. It is believed, and I think there are statistics, and I cannot cite the citation, but I can get that for you if anybody would like it. 69% of gun criminals who acquire a gun from a source other than a licensed dealer in a transaction that did not require a background check. So we know criminals are getting guns without a background check. And when you see 69% of the criminals getting guns that do not have a background check, we need to address that issue. I think 594 addresses that issue.
Mr. Colberg, will the initiative solve this problem? Is that what illegal guns, is that where the violence is?
I don't think so. I know it's not going to solve the problem. There's no bite. There's nothing behind it that keeps people with criminal intent from going and getting a weapon or a firearm if that's what they choose to do. Statistics I have, I think Seattle Times primarily, 2 incidents. We're really turning to 2012 because that's the year that the FBI has the most recent data that's been released and published on the internet. In 2012, the 2 big incidents, or excuse me, 1 big incident that took place in Washington State was the Racer Cafe shooting. Trying to recall, the point that I was trying to make is would this initiative have stopped that from happening? The answer in that incident is absolutely not. Okay, the perpetrator of the crimes for the Racer Cafe, which made headlines, made a big deal, had the weapons that he had. I'm trying to recall if he was suffering from mental illness at that point or had been identified, but he had the weapons that he had before and maybe had fallen through the cracks before this incident happened. Wouldn't have stopped him. The incident at Seattle Pacific University, this would not have stopped that. So I'm going to bring this to attention. Part of the reason we're even discussing this right now is that it's the media that really has blown this out of proportion. The stats that I have, that I've looked up, if I can get my thing to work here, back up. I'm going to run through these. I have the references to the Racer Cafe shooting from 2012 and the SBU shooting this last spring in 2014. Stats that I have from the FBI, and this takes out suicides. It really gets down to the meat and potatoes of what we're talking about. We're talking about the media is the one making this, putting this out of order, and we're talking about really mass shootings and people being killed with firearms. If you're talking about suicides, you're talking about mental illness. There's still mental illness related to these mass shootings, mental illness issues, but we're talking about who's being killed in the different environments that we have in Washington. According to the FBI in 2012, 106 people were killed with firearm-related incidents. I wanted to acknowledge the fact that, no one here, there's nobody in this room that wants somebody to lose their life in a firearm homicide. I can guarantee that. It happens. People are people, and I think we all also realize that in this room. And so I don't think that there's Senator Chase acknowledged, we're not going to be able to stop this. There are people going to do it. But on the scale of 106 firearm-related homicides to 7 million people living in our state, that's a relatively low number. The percentages are very small. And so I'm looking at the trade-off. What is the cost of implementing, potentially threatening our rights, our constitutional rights to own firearms, and trying to prevent something from happening that isn't guaranteeing that that's going to happen. So I don't think it's worth it.
Thank you. Senator Chase, to kind of follow up on that, someone asks, I have depression. If 594 is passed, does that mean they can check my medical records or history, which is HIPAA protected? Can you talk about mental illness in general? And I know that as the follows on the Cafe Racer issue, what is the scope and application of the initiative?
When a person applies for a gun and they submit to a background check, if they have a determination of mental illness in their records, that would be noted. I cannot believe, and I haven't looked into this, that they would go in and read someone's personal medical records, but a diagnosis of mental illness would certainly show up. And I want to say I agree with my colleague that we're not going to be able to keep guns out of the hands of people who already own them unless they use those guns in the commission of a crime. But moving forward, if we can keep the guns out of the hands of criminals for the future, I think it is worth doing, because it could, not saying that it could make for safer communities. I happen to believe it would make for a safer community. I think that in domestic violence issues, situations, as an example, that if we can keep people who are under a court order, for example, from getting a gun and perhaps stopping. You can never say what someone would do in the future. You just cannot do so. But if they can't get a gun, then they're not going to be able to kill their spouse or significant other. I think that's worth doing.
Mr. Colberg, mental illness in the initiative. How do we keep the guns out of the hands of dangerous people?
One of the questions that came to mind last night as I was thinking through this is a significant problem that this is going to create. People that might identify themselves as potentially going through, coming up with depression, or having depression come on, or some other mental illness. The problem we're going to have with this is if they are knowledgeable of this and know that their gun rights will be restricted if they're identified as having mental illness, they're going to probably avoid going in for getting treatment, seeing a doctor, getting their mental illness addressed. So I think that's going to be a major issue that's going to further increase the problems that we have with mentally ill citizens, Washington State citizens, that already have mental illnesses that are not being dealt with through the state Medicaid system in regard to being treated properly, fully, given the attention that they need, and being able to avoid the mental illness situations that are leading to some of the firearm violence issues that we see. I'm going to go back and say that again. I want to stress some of these numbers because I think they're really important. The media has blown this out of proportion. I'm not saying it doesn't happen, but the significance of what's happening. A couple other stats that I have that I think are important to looking at the rates of what's happening in Washington State is that I have a stat that says no Washington State elementary, junior high, or high school has ever been invaded by someone that's intent on shooting mass quantities of people. That's ever. This has only happened twice in Washington State in universities. One was in 1973 in Gonzaga University, and I believe that was 3 people were killed in that incident, and then SPU, where 1 person was killed. And so, once again, the media is making it look like it's bad. It's not as bad as it is. But we do have a mental illness issue, and that's something that I think our state can do to address any kinds of gun violence. Again, there are stats. Gun violence is half of what it used to be at its peak in 1993. It's half of the rate that it was in 1993. So we've already, as a country, have made progress. I think this is one that is really important to this. Sorry, I lost my train of thought on that. Apologize, I lost it.
Well, don't go away. I'll give you something to jog your memory. Would you like a follow-up?
I would.
I think we got pretty liberal formating going here.
Sorry, I didn't mean to go over that much.
Thank you very much. I would like to put on the record that the reason that we have made such progress since 1993 is that that's the year when the Brady background checks went into effect. And this was a response to the mentally ill person who shot President Reagan. And so the Brady Handgun Violence Prevention Act of 1993 mandates background checks of gun buyers in order to prevent sales to people prohibited under the 1968 legislation. Now, the 1968 legislation was in response to the murders of John Kennedy, Bobby Kennedy, Martin Luther King, and others. And it prohibits all convicted felons, drug users, and mentally ill from buying guns. And it raises the age to purchase a handgun to 21 years of age. So I think background checks work. The only thing different after 1993 was the background checks. And if we have cut gun violence by, did you say half 50%? 49%, it works. So I think that this would, 594 would extend those protections to more people in our state.
Let me feed you the next question, which I think will follow on, so you can take the rebuttal, because this one is directed specifically to you, and you had mentioned before that it's being blown out of proportion, but there is a problem in mental illness. So they asked, do you have alternative legislation that would close these real loopholes? And so how big is the problem, and how should we?
Okay, that's somewhat related to what I wanted to say in response. Thank you. So I'm an educator, and I look at this as a presentation of a solution to a problem that's not going to have the effect that we want it to have. The negative effect is it's going to affect, like I said, I'm going to estimate at least 1 million people negatively, okay? It's not going to stop the few people that are accessing the guns from doing that, okay? So it's going to have the negative consequence. We need to look at positive alternatives. As an educator, I've been involved with starting a nonprofit. We provide hands-on activities for kids that engage them in learning. This was science education. It was called Science Decathlon was what I was involved in starting. Science Olympiad is another organization that operates really well in Lake Forest Park, in Washington State. So these are things that we can do for our youth. I think we need to look at starting to tackle this issue with our youth. The numbers of the mass killings that you've seen over the course of, 20 years, most of those are related to kids that are on psychotropic drugs, okay, for dealing with depression or ADHD or other psychological issues that they've been diagnosed with and treated medically. I was talking to Sheila earlier. I'm really a big fan of adults engaging with kids, developing relationships, working as mentors, and providing them with engaging activities where you actually make a difference in their lives, starting young, starting 12 or 13 years old. And those ages were 12 through about 25 years old. So that's just the educational. Let's bring adults in. I'd say let's bring churches in. Let's get these kids some adult mentors and supervision. If it has to happen through the mental health facilities that we have and the Medicaid programs, and that we can work on stepping up, and I'll call on Senator Chase to potentially do that through the state. I'm not involved with state legislature at this point, but to really focus on that instead of putting something like this in place that really isn't going to do anything except to the people that shouldn't be penalized for their responsible behavior. So that's a major thing. I'm looking at education, and that's how I want to do it. I work with youth. I work with youth through our churches, through our schools, and that kind of thing. But I also think that I'm looking at volunteer. We have Center for. There's an organization. I just heard this through the city council presentation. There's an organization out of it's actually, I think, in Shoreline near Hamlin Park. Center for Human Services that works with youth and providing mental health. And I just found out of what they do, and I'm looking at going and volunteering. And so that's what I would call on adults in our communities to do, is actually get out there, volunteer, interact with these kids, and not just pretend to do it, but engage and create relationships. So that's really my solution to it. So I think we can put together that kind of legislation.
Senator Chase, why wouldn't that be effective? Why do we need the initiative then?
You know, every once in a while we hear about a young child picking up a gun and shooting it, and that will tear at your heartstrings. And last year in the legislature, year before last in the legislature, I, along with one of my colleagues, Senator Pam Roach, who is a staunch member of the National Rifle Association, and I, who come from a family with long membership in the National Rifle Association, proposed a bill to implement training in our public schools, and it was called Eddie Eagle, and it's an educational program from the NRA. Teaches young children that if you go into a home or in a car or someplace and you see a gun, it teaches young children, say below third grade or so, stop, don't touch, leave the area, and tell an adult. Now that is something that we were able to get through the Senate. We were not able to get through the House. Many people have tried to get sensible gun legislation through the legislature. It hasn't happened, which is the reason that Initiative 594 has been proposed to the people. If the people want it, then let the people vote on it. And I think that would probably do as much as we possibly can on educating young children. There are some additional education programs that the NRA has, that I think are pretty good. But I come from, my family has been members of the National Rifle Association since the 1920s. And it used to be a social club, and it had to do with rifles, National Rifle Association. And my family is very proud of that association. But in the 70s, the National Rifle Association has been, I want to say, taken over, perhaps, by munitions manufacturers, manufacturers of assault weapons. That is not what the intent of the National Rifle Association was for. You know, people like to shoot guns. I mean, my mother was a champion sharpshooter. My older brother is a champion marksman. You know, it's not that people who want gun background checks are anti-gun. Some of them are, but not all of them. We're trying to keep weapons out of the hands of people who could cause danger to other people. And that's why I think this is a good piece of legislation.
I think I think we're balanced there. So we'll start back with Senator Chase. Where does Washington fall in how strict the gun laws are versus nationally? Are we different, the same, more or less? Yes.
We're sort of in the middle. I have statistics on the top, or the 10 states with the most strict gun laws, and statistics on the states with the least restrictive gun laws. And the statistics show that the states with the least restrictive gun laws have higher incidents of gun violence than do states with more rigid gun laws. I don't have, I can, if whoever asked that question, I certainly can provide you with the details. I don't have them right here. Pardon me?
Were we on either list, most strict, least?
No. We're in the middle. We're in the middle. We are not the least, and we're not the greatest. We're sort of in the middle, which is not a bad place to be, except that insane people, mentally ill people, criminals, can still get access to guns in our state by going to a gun show. There are no background checks in a gun show. They can buy guns on the internet. There are no background checks on the internet. The FBI had a sting operation, and they got a man down in a parking lot engaging in a gun transaction. I think in the last 6 months, I don't have the full details, because he was getting a gun for a person who could not pass a background check, which the federally licensed arms dealers would do. We have a lot of gun dealers in this state, particularly in the 32nd Legislative District. And there is nobody, I shouldn't say that, there are very few people in this state who live further than 10 miles from a gun dealer. I would think up in the northeast portion of the state, there aren't very many people there. There are a lot of guns, but not a lot of people. But it would not be an onerous responsibility to go get a background check.
Mr. Colberg, where do we stand on the spectrum, and what does that tell us about what we should or shouldn't be doing?
The stats that I've seen are dealing primarily with concealed carry licenses, and there are 3 categories for concealed carry. One is a shall issue, one is a restrictive issue, and there's another one that is no requirement whatsoever. I want to say Montana is one that doesn't require. I'm going to guess there are 6 or so states that don't have a requirement for background checks for a concealed carry license. Vermont being one of those. She's citing some statistics about being restrictive and not restrictive, and I think Vermont, it doesn't have a very high population, so I don't know. A lot of these statistics is really dependent on the population, where you are, what's going on. There are lots of factors that play in here. But Vermont has been awarded for being a safe state in terms of gun ownership, and they don't have a lot of restriction on concealed carry or open carry or anything like that. I would, again, agree with Senator Chase that we're in the middle. We are a shall carry state, which means that anyone that is would pass a background check, such as being mentally competent, not a felon, not have any drug-related background issues, can apply through their local police department and get. There's no decision involved with it. Be issued a concealed carry license. So in that regard, I'd say we're in the middle. I want to address the gun show loophole. I looked this up heavily yesterday because I knew this was going to be an issue today. At all of the gun shows in Washington State, there are background checks. there are laws related to those that are being observed by all the organizers of the gun shows. The most strict is the largest. It is the one from Washington. Sorry, I should know that at the top of my head. The two big ones that happen usually in Monroe and down in Puyallup, and they actually run background checks of all their members as you want to be coming in the door and going and purchasing a weapon. And you cannot purchase a weapon there without being a member and having a background check run at those gun shows. And I'm actually one. I went in with a what are they called? Thank you. A passport to one of them, and they would not issue me. They wouldn't let me in to go and purchase a weapon. They wouldn't issue me a membership. I had to go back and I didn't have my driver's license with me, and I had to go back and get my driver's license before I could do that. There are three others that I remember: Falcon, a guy named Wes something down south, and another one down south. And the Falcon, there's the BAT flaws, the Bureau of Alcohol and Tobacco and Firearms, that has a pretty high restriction, and I will acknowledge that it's the Brady Law that a lot of times they'll reference when they do this. And the Brady Law, so I haven't looked at the Brady Law to know how what the requirements are of background checks through the Brady Law, but they're obviously different than what's being asked of us through 594. And I'd say two of these other gun show organizers are requiring that their people selling firearms at their gun shows are following those BAT flaws, is what I'm calling them. And a third one is what she referenced was the 1968 Gun Control Act, and so the last one does reference a requirement of all their sales at gun shows. So the accusation or the statement that there are not background checks done, or there are people going in straw and going into gun shows and purchasing guns, is simply not true. Now, parking lots and black market, that's a whole nother story. And yes, I would suggest that we look at targeting that specifically, but again, not targeting myself and million plus other individuals in Washington State that are not committing crimes. It's the black market that may be potentially related to internet, but I can address that later too.
Can I get a quick response on that?
Yeah, we went long on that one, so if you want 30 seconds, no, I'd rather hear the answer. Than
So I am extremely pleased to hear that the gun shows are voluntarily doing background checks. So they're already incurring the expenses. So, and that tells me that Initiative 594 will not generate additional costs to them since they're already doing it.
Okay, why don't I give this one to Mr. Colberg to start? We're here talking about 594, but when you get your ballot, there's also an Initiative 591. What do you think we should do with that? And then we'll hear from what Senator Chase thinks we ought to do with 591.
Okay, I think vote for both of them, although I am not actually in favor of either of them. Part of 591, I don't know the exact history of it. We were asked to kind of prepare for this last minute in terms of addressing 591. And what I understand of it's basically a measure that is going to be transitioning our state autonomy, as Washington State being able to create our own firearms-related laws, and really look at submitting that to the authority of the federal government, so that anything that would be produced on a federal level, we would then abide by those, like maybe, I don't know if it would be the Brady Law or anything like that, but we'd be abiding by anything that's put forth federally. I don't know as far as 591 goes in terms of supporting it. I think where we're at, I cited statistics that I think that the actual firearm homicide rate is not as serious and severe as it's being presented to us as the public by the media that has an interest in this financially. They sell shows. That's what they do. They make it seem glorious. And so that's something that I would suggest that 591 is going to act as an alternative to 594. I'd say it's the better of the two choices. But at that rate, I'd say vote for 591 and not 594. Just as a countermeasure. There's politics behind that. I'm not a politician, but there's politics in Washington State that I think is important here.
Senator Chase, what about 591?
So I find 591 fascinating. It's a one-page bill. One page, that's all it is. And it amends Chapter 9.41 of the This is the RCW, Revised Code of Washington. And what the Initiative 951 would do, by adding these new sections, it makes it unlawful for the government to require background checks unless a uniform national standard is required. And it also makes it unlawful for any government agency to confiscate guns or other firearms from citizens without due process. So suppose the police come across a felon, and he says, "You can't take my gun." Well, oh yeah, they can. Right now they can, and they do. They do. So it is not even that, and it also, when they talk about the background, unless the uniform national standard is required, a lot of people are asserting that this would lower the laws that we have for regulating firearms as they currently are in our state. I find it interesting that the National Rifle Association is not even working on this 591. They're putting all of their effort behind defeating 594. I think you should vote yes on 594 and no on 591.
Thank you. I'm down to the last couple here, and so let me try and synthesize them. I would like some clarity, I think, myself, on what the con side is talking about in these transfers turning people into criminals. Can you run us through that? In my understanding, if I go hunting and somebody carries my gun from the car or out, that's going to be a crime, and is that what you're worried about, or am I missing the boat here?
Yeah, so there's a lot to understand. It's 18 pages long, and I actually think it's intent to be complicated so that people can understand and don't read it. And there's a heading. I included on this 8.5 by 11 sheet in the ads going out, and the statement is "Pledge your vote to save lives today," and vote for 594. The other one is background checks save lives, and I think that's really all people see. They don't read this legislation, and they don't know what's really going on behind the scenes. There are provisions, as I stated before, in 594 that you can more easily understand through this if you can get out your magnifying glass. I'm going to go through this list briefly, not expand on this right now. There's a provision for affirmative defense. So basically, if something, maybe you have in a home invasion, and somehow or another a gun needs to be transferred, you can actually transfer guns between spouses, domestic partners. So you can transfer the guns in the affirmative defense. But let's say, like my son, for some reason needs to have this in the situation of a home invasion or a threatening situation. It does allow for that provision for that. You can gift a gun to a family member. You cannot loan a gun to a family member. Okay, and that includes the gifting, and the family member is defined by your grandparents, cousins, aunts, and uncles, so close proximity family members. You can gift an old gun, or you can transfer old guns under this provision, like 1897 or older collector's items. You can hand a gun to a gunsmith. They typically will also be federally firearm licensed dealers, so they will be allowed to handle the gun in the first place. So gunsmiths are allowed. I said spouses under here. Children under 18 have to be with they have to be supervised with an adult who is not a felon or anything else that would be illegal in that way. Gun ranges. It's giving a provision for gun ranges, but there are no legal gun ranges that can do this in Washington State. So it really it eliminates the idea of two friends going to the gun range to practice with their shotguns, as I have done, and found that the gun that I'm practicing with, that I was borrowing, was my friend's wife's gun, was too short for me. So I couldn't hit what I was aiming at. So there is this natural flow of guns between friends when they go and do things for recreational purposes. That happens naturally, and it shouldn't be an illegal activity. So, and at gun ranges, that won't happen. You can't do that as it stands. Another one of these provisions is for competition. So there is a provision for, I think, transfer of guns during a competition. But question.
Just a clarification. I think the question was what normal behavior would be illegal.
And I'm about to get to that. I wanted to say these are the provisions. Thank you for clarifying. These are the provisions that it allows for. there are the recreational use, pretty much the recreational use of guns on public, private, I'm trying to think of the other place, but those are the typical places where, let's say, you're going to go hunting with a friend. You really can't, let's say duck hunting, I'm using the duck hunting example. You really can't transfer that gun. That friend couldn't transfer that gun. He'd have to loan it to you until, let's say, you got to your duck blind. You can't be near roads or any state types of developed facilities. It can be on hunting grounds, but it has to be kind of in the backwoods as far as hunting goes. That is not recreational shooting. So I think that's one of the major. Another one would be, I wanted to address domestic violence. My wife is a family law attorney, and she's told me, she's 15 years in family law, worked with a lot of families, and really firearms are not as much of an issue within domestic abuse situations. She says typically any violence going on within domestic situations is their passions of crime. It's somebody grabbing something that's close to them and hitting them or throwing or something like that. It doesn't as much have to do with firearms and somebody getting injured or shot to death with a firearm. She also noted that in this, a lot of times these domestic violence situations, if there is a firearm related, would be somebody that already previously owns this. And there probably are circumstances where they're being issued a court order where they're supposed to stay away from, and they already own the gun, and it's a bad situation. But in general, there's going to be the ownership of the gun ahead of time. The other point I wanted to make with domestic violence situations is, let's say a woman is threatened. She can't go, and maybe she can't afford, or she doesn't have the time. She can't go borrow a gun to protect herself from a domestic abuse situation. She would actually have to go through this 14-day process to do that.
Thank you. We ran long, but at least I have a better understanding now of what your concerns are. No, Senator Chase, so is the initiative criminalizing benign behavior, and will it solve the domestic violence problem, or at least reduce a few?
Well, this is Initiative 594, and this is, and I think you have it, the analysis by the nonpartisan professional staff in the legislature. And on page 3, it talks about exemptions, and I'd like to just briefly go over them. The following are exempt from a background check check requirements established in the Act: gifts between family members, antique firearms, law enforcement. I'll go quickly here. Gunsmiths for the service, repair, return, temporary transfers. If the transfer is necessary to prevent imminent death or great bodily harm to the transferee, if the transfer lasts only as long as needed and the transferee is not prohibited from possessing firearms, between spouses, at an established shooting range authorized by local governing body. We have private shooting ranges. I don't know that we have public shooting ranges. I have to check on that. At a lawful organized firearm competition or performance, persons under 18 years of age for lawful hunting, sporting, or educational purposes while under the direct supervision of a responsible adult. And while legally hunting, if the transferee has completed all required training and holds all of the required licenses and permits and is not prohibited from possessing a firearm. And finally, acquisition of a firearm other than a pistol by inheritance or acquisition of a pistol by inheritance within the preceding 60 days, after which time the person must either transfer the pistol or notify the Department of Licensing that the person is retaining the pistol. You know, there are huge exemptions on this bill, and I just wanted to make sure that we put that on the record. And as far as domestic violence, 226 women were murdered with guns. Now, that is not to say that all instances of domestic violence include a firearm. It doesn't at all. It just says of 1/3 of all the murders of women in this state occurred in an intimate partner context. And the number of women murdered in this state with guns is 1.5 times the number of soldiers, Washington State soldiers, who have died in both the Iraq and Afghanistan war. That, to me, should send alarms. We need to make sure that people who have a restraining order, who are a felon or whatever in these domestic violence situations do not have access to a gun.
That's already the case. They're already prohibited under current law.
I agree. They're prohibited, but they still have them.
And so a new law won't stop that.
Well, I will do anything to stop the murder of women. And when we find 1/3 of all of the women who are murdered are murdered by firearms in domestic violence, we need to see what we can do. And we may not be able to stop what's happened in the past or people who already have guns, but we should be able to do so in the future. That's why I think this is a good initiative.
The last question on my list, which sort of follows up on that, and maybe you can answer, is then why won't all the bad guys just go to Portland?
Who's answering?
Senator Chase first, and then we'll, after you can both address that briefly, and then we'll go to closing.
I think that the state of Oregon will probably be implementing some similar measure to protect their people from these guns. I personally think that felons, most likely, would go to Portland to get a gun. There's no question in my mind that if they're not stopped here, if they can't go to the internet, which they do now, if they can't go to some parking lot, they will in fact go to Oregon. And that's not to say that I am also saying, I want to be clear on the record. I come from a family of membership in the NRA, people who shoot guns, who do target practicing, who are quite good. But we still believe that there should be some kind of control over felons, mentally ill people, people under subpoenas from obtaining guns in the future. We can't do a whole lot about what they already have unless we can catch them with it. But this is a way to move forward, and I urge your support.
Mr. Colberg, a minute or so on why a small step's not at least a start?
Well, as far as going to Portland, that'll probably happen. I think, to me, one of the more common things that the criminals will do is just simply break into people's homes and steal weapons, take them from whatever way they can. They're going to still. The references to the internet and the gun show loophole. I've actually purchased a handgun over the internet, and I had to have it sent to an FFL and go through the whole background check process through the FFL through the internet. Now there are sources on the internet that basically, like I think Craigslist was one. I don't know. I've never actually looked anything up on Craigslist, but where there might be people that put up an ad saying they're selling a gun, and they're not going to be, they might make the transaction happen in a parking lot, as we're saying. I'd still chalk that up as being black market. If this is happening in a way where people are not providing information about what they're doing in the streets and the parking lots, that maybe is a specific issue that we need to deal with. But I would say that this is the shotgun approach to trying to deal with gun violence issues that's really not going to solve the problem. And so, maybe finding ways to target black market. I don't know how you restrict internet communications, because as far as I'm aware, a lot of it can be done without people acknowledging who they are. Stepped up law enforcement to run sting operations for that kind of thing. It is not the gun show loophole in Washington State that is being used for advertising purposes. It sounds really good, but it's really not the case. So I really, once again, I go back to the numbers and say, yeah, it's happening, but it's really not happening on the scale that we're all responding to. And I don't want to be a person that is saying that we don't need to do something. I'm actually saying that we do need to do something, but it's not put gun control in place. It's called dealing with mental health issues and dealing with our youth and child neglect. Those are the things that we really need to address, not gun control.
Thank you. Thank you both for a lot of insightful analysis. We talked about 3 minutes for closing. Senator Chase, you're up.
Thank you very much for staying for this discussion that we're having. And I thank the people who might be watching this online. I think this is an important issue that needs to have full discussion in a democracy. I would like to give you a brief summary of the bill, so we make sure that we know what, the issues that we're debating here. The bill provides that all firearm sales and transfers in whole or in part in Washington are subject to a background check unless specifically exempted by federal or state law. We want a background check. That's what this bill does. And it requires firearm sales and transfers between unlicensed dealers. That would be the gun show, the loophole that you hear a lot about. They are not required, because they are not federally licensed, to conduct a background check. I am pleased that many of them are voluntarily doing so, but they're not required to do so by law, and I think it needs to be in statute. And it establishes penalties and exemptions and make some other minor changes to the governing of firearms transactions. So that's what the bill does. And the reason why I support it so strongly is that I believe we must get control of the violence that is being perpetrated by guns in irresponsible hands. I'm not talking about responsible gun owners. I am talking about irresponsible people who get their hands on guns. I think we need to do everything possible to make sure that that doesn't happen. And I think background checks, we know it cuts the number of deaths. We've heard it from my colleague here that we have had a 50% decline from the results of the Brady bill. I think we can do better by having it in this state too. I'm not opposed to guns. I'm in favor of responsible gun ownership, responsible use of guns. And I think 594, imperfect though it may be, is our best avenue for starting to get a hold of this issue. I thank you very much.
Thank you, Senator. Mr. Colberg.
Yeah, I think the key thing here is that we're looking at putting together legislation that is really only going to penalize responsible people, and I don't think legislation works that way. Okay, it's not going to penalize actual criminals and stop the behaviors that we are targeting, that we all want to stop. I'm going to jump to the side of looking at, actually I want to move to a different note here and recognize that the WACOPS, the Washington Association of Police and Sheriffs, which represents over 7,500 police and sheriffs rank and file in Washington state, are supportive of supportive of I-591 and opposing 594. And I'm going to read this. It says, the restrictive compliance measures of transfers and loans of guns will cause law-abiding citizens to unintentionally commit crimes and possibly be convicted of gross misdemeanors or Class C felonies. Additionally, Washington State Law RCW 4041 also states that no person convicted of a felony is legally owned to own a firearm. As a result, there will be unintended consequences of the I-594 legislation being enacted, and that is those people that are being responsible, that don't know what this law is going to do to them, commit a crime unknowingly, become felons, and then are no longer able to own those firearms that they owned and were not using irresponsibly. So it's just bad news all around. I think it's real important to note that there are multiple sources out there that identify the fact that increased gun ownership and responsible gun ownership through concealed carry or open carry as a net effect, and this is acknowledged by the Clinton administration, a lot of these stats are a little old, acknowledge that at least 1.5, I think I have this stat, I'm going to read it off of here. This stat on the top of the sheet that I've given you is at least 1.5, let me look at it here, sorry. Cases, there are at least 1.5 cases of self-defense where a firearm is used for people to protect themselves, whether in homes or out in public or different things. So that is a significant statistic that we're taking to this as compared to the number of people that are actually killed. So even though the pro 594 campaign is claiming that it's going to save that putting 594 in place is going to save lives. The net impact is actually, based on statistics from multiple resources, is actually going to have the opposite effect, as well as penalizing responsible people. With that, I will call for people to put forward an alternative, and that is to help our youth work with neglected children, people kids whose parents are putting them in front of TVs and video games as a babysitter. They spend lots of time in basements and not getting outdoors and doing engaging activities. Call on our educators to step forward, and parents and seniors and people to volunteer to be mentors of those people, and especially for our state to step up its efforts with working with the mentally ill in our state.
Thank you very much, both of you, and for everyone in attendance today. Thank you for shedding a little light on what's going on.
Thank you. Absolutely.
Thank you.
Appreciate
Thank
being
you
here.
all.
Thank you very much. Good to meet you. Yeah. Thank you.